a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times, and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Mel Gibson paused for a moment before making a claim that sounded almost like a confession. There is an ancient Bible that most of the world has never actually read. It is older than many of the traditions people associate with the modern Bible, contains more books, and according to Gibson, presents a very different picture of the end times from the one most people have been taught. So what was left out? Why did these writings disappear from Western Christianity, and who decided which scriptures should survive the Bible most people never knew existed? When Mel Gibson began speaking publicly about the Ethiopian Bible, many people assumed he was simply another celebrity wandering into controversial territory. But scholars familiar with Ethiopian Christian texts weren't particularly shocked. If anything, they were glad the subject was finally receiving wider attention. The Bible, most Western Christians recognize as complete, contains 66 books, but it is not the only biblical tradition that survived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a much larger collection of sacred writings, with a canon containing more than 80 books. That isn't just a small difference in the table of contents. It represents an entirely different scriptural tradition. Among these additional writings are ancient works such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, and the Didaskalia. These were not simply modern inventions or obscure stories created centuries later. Many circulated among early Christian communities and remained important within certain traditions, even as they disappeared from the Western biblical canon. Ethiopia preserved them. For nearly 2,000 years, Ethiopian monks continued copying these manuscripts by hand in isolated monasteries, mountain communities, and remote highland regions. They weren't necessarily protecting the texts because they wanted to challenge Rome. They preserved them because they believed the writings carried important spiritual messages that future generations might eventually need. And there was another barrier protecting these manuscripts from the outside world. Many were written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language that today can only be read fluently by a relatively small number of specialists. For centuries, that language barrier made the contents of these texts largely inaccessible to most Western readers. If you want to understand what these ancient writings actually say about the future, stay with us and subscribe, because we're going deeper into the prophecies, the missing books, and the traditions that survived for centuries outside the Western canon. How Ethiopia became the guardian of these texts. To understand why Ethiopia preserved writings that disappeared elsewhere, you first have to understand its unique Christian history. Christianity reached Ethiopia during the 4th century. Around the same period, it was becoming increasingly established throughout the Roman Empire. But Ethiopian Christianity developed along its own path and remained relatively isolated from the institutions that eventually dominated Western Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed its own traditions, calendar, liturgical practices, and biblical canon. Its religious history was shaped by a different environment, allowing texts that disappeared from Western Christianity to remain part of its tradition. And this is where the story becomes controversial. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is often portrayed as a major moment in Christian history, but it is important to separate historical evidence from later claims about what the Council actually decided. The Council dealt primarily with theological disputes, such as the nature of Christ, and did not simply choose the modern 66-book Bible in one meeting. Still, over the centuries, different Christian communities developed different biblical canons, and some ancient writings gradually fell out of use in the Western tradition while remaining important elsewhere. That difference is exactly what makes the Ethiopian biblical tradition so fascinating. What disappeared from one branch of Christianity was sometimes preserved by another, copied generation after generation until manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost remained alive. Quietly and gradually, those writings disappeared from the Western tradition. Officially, the Christian canon was eventually treated as settled and complete, but Ethiopia never accepted that idea. Its church continued preserving texts that had vanished elsewhere. And because Ethiopia remained largely independent from European colonial rule, its monasteries, language, traditions, and ancient scriptures survived with far less outside interference. By the 6th century, the explorer Cosmas Indicopleustes had described Ethiopia as a powerful Christian kingdom, where the faith was deeply woven into society and where Christians escaping persecution could find refuge. Ethiopia offered them protection, a place to live, and the freedom to practice their beliefs without submitting to Rome. And that matters because when a religious tradition isn't controlled by an outside empire, it doesn't have to reshape its sacred writings to satisfy that empire. It can preserve the texts it believes are important and pass them from one generation to the next. For centuries, however, the wider Western world paid little attention. Ancient Ethiopian manuscripts remained hidden inside highland monasteries, protected by monks who understood the importance of what they were preserving. Only in the modern era did scholars begin examining these writings more seriously and realizing how much material had survived outside the familiar Western Bible. But the real mystery begins when you look at what these texts say about humanity's final age, what the Ethiopian Bible says about the end times. This is where the story becomes especially fascinating. The Ethiopian biblical tradition contains descriptions of the final age that differ in important ways from the familiar Western interpretation of end times prophecy. Western Christian traditions often portray the end as a dramatic sequence of wars, disasters, plagues, supernatural events, and divine judgment. Revelation, in particular, presents an apocalyptic world filled with enormous external signs and catastrophes. But some Ethiopian texts place much greater emphasis on something happening inside humanity itself. According to the Book of the Covenant, Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples after the resurrection, teaching them about what would eventually come. The warning attributed to him was not simply about earthquakes, wars, or destruction. It focused on the spiritual condition of people living in the final age. People would still know his name. They would still repeat his teachings. They would still build enormous churches and gather inside them. Yet, according to the text, many would lose sight of the actual spirit behind those teachings. The buildings would remain crowded, but the deeper meaning would slowly disappear. And that is where the warning becomes uncomfortable. The false leaders described in these writings would not necessarily come from outside the faith. They could emerge from within the very institutions created in the name of religion. They would use sacred teachings to gain influence, wealth, and authority while speaking publicly about spiritual salvation. The message would remain visible, but its original purpose could become buried beneath power and ambition. And when religious teachings are used to protect the powerful while ignoring people who are suffering, the texts present that as a warning sign that humanity has entered a dangerous period. Then the warnings turn toward the natural world. Earthquakes, rising waters, unusual signs in the sky, and events that leave even wise people uncertain are described as signals of a greater transformation. But these events are not necessarily presented as simple punishments. They are more like warnings, early signs of something approaching, similar to the first contractions before a birth. And then comes the warning that may be the most unsettling of all. The greatest danger isn't necessarily the earthquake, the flood, or the strange event in the sky. It is the moment when human beings become so emotionally and spiritually numb that nothing can move them anymore. The Ethiopian texts describe this condition as a kind of great silence, a period when people may continue living, speaking, worshipping, and building, while something essential inside them has gone quiet. And what those texts say happens during that silence is where the story becomes even more disturbing. The 4 stages of the final age. When Mel Gibson spoke about the Ethiopian Bible, this is the section that reportedly drew the most attention. Among the most fascinating passages in these traditions is a framework describing the final age through 4 distinct stages. Scholars who study Ethiopian manuscripts note that this particular structure does not have a direct equivalent in the familiar Western biblical canon. The first stage begins almost unnoticed. It is described as the age of forgetting. Humanity doesn't suddenly reject truth. Instead, people slowly lose the desire to search for it. Deep questions become less important. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Reflection feels unnecessary. Eventually, truth itself starts to feel inconvenient, and people choose not to look any further. There is no dramatic event announcing the beginning, no warning siren, just a gradual fading of curiosity and a quiet decision to stop asking difficult questions. The second stage is the age of spectacle. This is where constant entertainment begins replacing wisdom. People become surrounded by noise, information, and endless stimulation, yet become increasingly uncomfortable with silence and deep thought. Distraction becomes so constant that simply sitting alone with one's thoughts can feel unbearable. The texts present this not merely as a cultural problem, but as a spiritual crisis, a civilization becoming so consumed by noise that it can no longer recognize the quieter voice of truth. Then comes the third stage, the age of the false shepherd. This is where the warning becomes much more serious. Leaders begin using the name of God while pursuing power, wealth, and influence for themselves. The danger, according to the tradition, is that these figures don't necessarily appear to be enemies of faith. They speak its language. They quote its teachings. They stand inside its institutions. And because they appear to represent something sacred, they become much harder to recognize. Then comes the fourth and most unsettling stage, the Great Silence. This isn't described as the peaceful silence of a sacred place. Instead, it represents a point where humanity's connection to the divine has become so distant that even those genuinely searching for it struggle to feel anything. The warning isn't necessarily that God has disappeared. It is that humanity has drifted so far that it can no longer recognize the presence that was always there. And according to these traditions, what happens after that is even more unexpected. The 7 seals of the heart. If you've heard of the 7 seals in the Book of Revelation, you probably associate them with enormous cosmic events and catastrophic judgments unfolding across the world. But the Ethiopian tradition presents another interpretation. Here, the seals are connected not to the outside world, but to the inner condition of a human being. The real struggle of the final age isn't necessarily happening in the heavens or on a battlefield. It is happening inside every individual. The first is the seal of comfort. It represents the moment when someone chooses comfort over truth. Real growth can be uncomfortable, but instead of questioning what they believe, a person chooses whatever makes them feel safe. The second is the seal of pride. This happens when someone becomes so convinced that they already possess the answers that they stop listening, learning, or questioning themselves. Pride doesn't always appear as arrogance. Sometimes it looks like absolute certainty, the quiet belief that there is nothing left to discover. And according to the ancient warning, that certainty can become its own kind of blindness. I can continue the next section in the same length, tone, and flowing YouTube style, and the texts describe this as one of the strongest barriers standing between a person and genuine awakening. The third is the seal of fear, a life controlled by the constant need for safety and security. When fear begins making every decision, people can become willing to overlook uncomfortable truths simply because accepting them feels dangerous. According to the texts, this seal becomes especially powerful during the final age because instability makes people naturally more desperate for certainty. The fourth is the seal of distraction. Every quiet moment gets filled with entertainment, noise, work, and endless activity. There is no time left to stop, reflect, or listen. When every moment is occupied, there is no space for an inconvenient truth to enter. The fifth is the seal of false community. This happens when people surround themselves only with those who already agree with them. Their world becomes an echo chamber where every belief is constantly reinforced and opposing ideas are pushed away. The texts consider this particularly dangerous in the final age, when finding a group that confirms everything you already believe has become easier than ever. The sixth is the seal of false mercy, when forgiveness becomes an excuse to avoid responsibility or personal change. Comfort begins to look like compassion, while accountability is treated as cruelty. And then comes the seventh seal, described as the most dangerous of them all, the seal of religion itself. This is the moment when sacred words, rituals, traditions, and outward displays of faith become a mask covering something spiritually empty. The performance of belief replaces the actual experience of it. But according to the tradition, breaking through all seven seals doesn't result in some spectacular sign appearing in the sky. There is no supernatural reward waiting at the end. Instead, the person who breaks through them becomes part of the awakening itself. And that leads directly into one of the most unsettling parts of the prophecy, the warning about the final empire and the invisible cage surrounding humanity. The final empire and the cage nobody sees. Another Ethiopian Christian text outside the Western canon is the Didaskalia, an early Christian work that takes the story in an even darker direction. It warns of what can be interpreted as a final empire, not simply a nation or military power, but a vast system capable of controlling people so subtly that they may never realize they are trapped. Its greatest weapon isn't chains, it's comfort. People receive food, entertainment, convenience, and endless distractions, while believing those things represent freedom. The more comfortable they become, the less likely they are to question the system around them. And the most powerful form of control may be the illusion of choice, having countless options while still being guided toward the same destination. The Ethiopian tradition carries another warning. Those who recognize the cage yet continue choosing truth and love are the ones who remain free. But the prophecy becomes even stranger when it describes where truth will emerge. Not from kings, not from powerful institutions, not from magnificent cathedrals. Instead, it comes from unexpected places, from deserts, prisons, and forgotten people who have been ignored by those in power. And perhaps the most disturbing warning is this: those who believe they are already prepared for the final age may be the least likely to recognize it when it arrives. For generations, Ethiopian monks preserved these traditions while asking one question: if the cage already exists, will humanity recognize it or become so comfortable inside it that it stops searching for the door? And that leads to the prophecy they guarded most carefully. The prophecy of the final witness. This is the section often connected to the modern fascination surrounding Mel Gibson's interest in Ethiopian biblical traditions. According to later Ethiopian interpretations, Jesus gave his disciples a final vision before his ascension, describing what humanity would face during its last days. Ethiopian scholars have connected this tradition with what is often called the prophecy of the final witness. But instead of focusing only on wars and disasters, the prophecy asks a much more personal question. When the final age arrives, who will recognize it? The answer is unexpected. Not an angel, not a supernatural sign, not some cosmic event visible to everyone. The final witness is a generation. Ordinary people who, even in the darkest period, refuse to remain silent. They may be mocked, suppressed, or pushed out of powerful institutions, but their message continues, reaching those willing to hear it. The warning is simple. Truth does not need a microphone to survive. And this is where the Ethiopian tradition becomes especially controversial. Some theologians argue that teachings criticizing religious leaders who misuse spiritual authority would have been uncomfortable for institutions gaining greater political influence. While those traditions disappeared from much of the Western world, Ethiopian monks continued copying and protecting their manuscripts in remote monasteries. And that raises the question that still matters today. Why were these ancient writings preserved for so long? And what might they still have to tell us? Mel Gibson is not an academic historian or theologian, but his interest in early Christianity brought enormous public attention to traditions that most Western audiences had never encountered. When discussion of the Ethiopian Bible and its apocalyptic writings reached a wider audience, many people were left asking the same question. Why had we never heard about this before? Scholars such as Ephraim Isaac have emphasized that Ethiopian religious literature preserves traditions with a very different perspective on the end times. Instead of focusing entirely on disasters happening around humanity, these writings can be read as warnings about what happens inside human beings and societies, and that distinction changes the entire meaning. If the end is simply an external catastrophe, then people can only wait, watch, and hope to survive it. But if the final age represents a spiritual condition developing within individuals, communities, and institutions, then the warning becomes much more personal. The 4 stages suddenly feel different. The age of forgetting, the age of spectacle, the age of the false shepherd, and finally, the great silence. The texts don't necessarily describe one specific date or event. They describe patterns of human behavior, and that is exactly what makes them so unsettling to modern readers. Yet the story doesn't end in hopelessness. The Ethiopian tradition ultimately points toward a message of renewal. The end is not necessarily the end of life, but the end of deception. Those who continue choosing truth and compassion, even when comfort and power seem easier, are promised that they will not be forgotten. For centuries, Ethiopian monks preserved these ancient writings by hand, believing that one day another generation might finally understand why they mattered.